And that beautiful dramatic soprano voice belongs to probably the greatest opera singer you have never heard of. And that may seem like a fairly untidy way to put it, but the essence of that is probably absolutely true. That is, that through the course of the 20th century, there were certain stupendously great singers whose names resonated with a wide swath of the American public and whose names resonate still today with opera fans and even with certain people. I mean, somebody like an Enrico Caruso, of course, is a beloved name, or a Kirsten Flagstead. Just as great, but very much forgotten by many, a tremendously important and gifted singer named Rosa Raisa. And what makes her especially important for us to talk about on the morning show is because her primary base of operation, operatically, was Chicago. And so right down the road from us, Rosa Raisa, through the late teens and in the 1920s and into the 1930s, was setting audiences on their feet, cheering with her stupendous singing. She is probably most famous for originating the role of Turandot. That would be the title role of Giacomo Puccini's final opera, which he did not live to complete. And in many ways, this was the summit of her career, but a career which enjoyed all kinds of tremendous success as well. Her personal story is a fascinating and moving one as well. We will explore all of this and more over the next few minutes with Charles Mintzer, who is surely the highest authority on the planet when it comes to this particular singer. Charles Mintzer became fascinated with this figure of Rosa Raisa many years ago and has devoted many years and countless hours to finding out as much as he possibly could about this singer, and eventually gathered all of that material together into a wonderful biography, which was actually published some years ago, called Rosa Raisa, a biography of a diva with selections from her memoirs, published by Northeastern University Press, and a book still available through places like Amazon. And I'm very honored to be speaking for the next few minutes with Charles Mintzer about this great opera singer, beloved for so many years in the great city of Chicago, Rosa Raisa. Charles Mintzer, we welcome you to the morning show.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Let's tell our listeners about how you first powerfully connected with this singer and became fascinated. If I remember correctly, it was in 1962 when she appeared in an intermission feature on a Metropolitan Opera broadcast.
Well, it goes way before that. In the early 50s, I come from Burlington, Vermont, hardly an operatic center, but I became an opera fan when I was just in my teens. And I used to come down to New York for every Christmas and Easter and summer, winter vacations. And I became a standee at the old Metropolitan. And there's a culture among the standees. They talk about the performances that they're now hearing and how obviously they're not as good as what they heard in their youth. And people in 1951, 52, when I started, when people like Zinka Milanoff and Barbieri and Leonard Warren and Delmonico and Siepi were operatic gods, we were constantly being told, yes, they're good, but we heard Rosa Poncell, we heard Resberg, we heard Pinza, we heard Martinelli, we heard DeLuca.
And they were really great.
and yeah, so, okay. So Raisa was a name that I had seen on some list years ago of singers of Jewish background. And, of course, I come from a Jewish background. My grandparents came from Eastern Europe, and I was just curious about her. So I went to the New York Public Library Music Division, which in those days was not far from the Metropolitan Opera, just 3 blocks away. And I used to pull out the old music magazines and read for hours and hours and hours reviews of the performances from the 19-teens and the 1920s and 30s and all these accounts of this glorious singer. And in those days, we didn't have Xerox machines. So I used to write by hand, copy out all the material, and I spent a lot of time doing this, and I became more and more interested. And in 1962, Raisa was on a Metropolitan Opera broadcast because this was the second year of the Turandot revival with Birgit Nilsson and Corelli. And she was interviewed by John Gutman, a pretty lengthy interview, and I wrote to her telling her that I had her records and that I even sent her a list of all the roles that she had done over the years, and she wrote me back the most beautiful letter saying that, remember, I didn't have her address, so I wrote to her care of Texaco, and they forwarded to her. And about a month later, I get this lovely letter telling me, she says, "You know about me more than I do myself." And that's in that sort of broken English. And she also sent me an autographed picture as Aida. In the meantime, even before that, I had written to Paul Hume, the music critic of the Washington Post, famous for that dust up with Harry Truman over daughter Margaret's singing abilities, because RCA had put out a series called Critics' Choice. They had Irvin Kolodin, an important music critic here in New York, and Paul Hume, and they picked out old 78 records that meant something to them that they thought were, for various reasons, top things. And he picked out Raisa's Gioconda record from 1933, and in the notes he said that Raisa's was the greatest voice he ever heard. So I wrote to him, care of the Washington Post, and he sent me a 6-page letter. And he said at the beginning, I apparently touched him on a very responsive place, and he just went on and on and on for 6 pages about the glories of Raisa, and he said, "Write me again and we'll talk." And I did write him, and he never answered. It was just one of those things. I got him at a moment when he just let it all out.
A floodgate of information.
A floodgate of anecdotes, information, and memories. And I also wrote to Vincent Sheen, who wrote a book called First and Last Love. Now, Vincent Sheen he was a very important American journalist, world traveler, but he started his opera going in the early 1910s, and while he was going to the University of Chicago, he was an usher at the Chicago Opera, and so he heard Raisa, Galli Corci, Mary Garden, and he talked very eloquently. And I wrote him, and he sent me his memories, and Claudia Cassidy, of the Chicago Tribune. So I got a lot of feedback, and then one of the most significant contacts was a man by the name of Charles Jehant. He is probably was America's preeminent opera historian. He knew more about opera singers. He had cards with the careers of 40,000 singers plus chronologies of opera houses all over the world. And I wrote to him. People where I got his address told me, "Well, he won't answer you." Well, not only did he answer me, Raisa was one of his all-time favorites. He grew up in Akron, Ohio, and used to hear the Chicago Opera in Cleveland, and then as a young man, he used to go to Chicago and New York, and throughout his life, he went to opera performances all over the world. He was in London in 1952 for the Callas Norma, so he really was an authority. And we bonded, and over the years, I visited him. He lived in the Washington suburbs. I visited him almost every year, and he was just a font of information. But he told me, he said, "Have you spoken to Carol Longoni?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, she was Raisa's accompanist. Maybe she'll talk to you. She's quite on in years now." So I went to the New York phone book. I found her phone number. I called her, and she was just couldn't be nicer. And I spent many days talking to her. And then Carol said to me, "Have you met Frida? That's Raisa's sister." I said, "No." And she contacted me, put me in contact with Frida, and that opened up another floodgate.
As you are describing this, it's so fun to think about
how you get
Yeah, I mean how one made these kind of connections and undertook a project like this in that time when one did not have some of the resources like the internet and all that it has given us that would make all of this in some ways a simpler matter, if maybe a little less fun. I mean, how intriguing and satisfying for you to slowly but surely build this network of people who could tell you so much about this wonderful singer.
Greg, you have it right. And in fact, let me put in a plug for the internet now. We're sort of digressing a little bit. A couple of years ago, I get a phone call, and somebody said Charles Mintzer, and oh dear, is this a telemarketer? But I answered, and they identified themselves, and they found me through the internet. And these were the grandchildren of the doctor who brought Raisa to Italy in 1906, Dr. Vigdorchik. They had changed their name from Vigdorchik to Victor, and I tried to find them under their new name, Victor, but it's such a common name, I had no way of locating them. And they found me. And this is after the book came out, but they invited me to their home in New York. The three brothers, one came from Washington, one came up from Mexico. We spent the most delightful afternoon, and they gave me some wonderful family pictures that I had never seen. And it couldn't have been nicer. And I learned a few little things that I could have used in the book, but nothing substantial. But it's the kind of thing that just it left me with such a positive feeling that it was not all in vain.
Well,
but that's the glory of the internet.
Absolutely. Well, in the meantime, through any means that you had at your disposal, you were able slowly but surely to construct a much clearer image of who this wonderful singer was, Rosa Raisa, about whom the old-timers at the Metropolitan Opera had spoken in such glowing terms.
Well, they heard her when she came to New York from 1918 to 1922 with the touring Chicago Opera, and they also heard her, believe it or not, from 1927 to 1931, the Chicago Opera was broadcast on national radio for an hour. It was the 8 to 9 o'clock time frame in Chicago, and was an hour later in New York. But people told me they heard her Jules of the Madonna, her Norma, her Trovatore, Aida on the radio. Only what took place between that time frame, but the Chicago Opera, and there were Muzio, Frida Leider, Mary Garden. These all, we think opera broadcasting started with the Met. National pickup was started with the Chicago Opera in 1927.
And the Chicago Opera, at least in these glory years, was presenting opera of the highest rank with some of the really great singers, many of whom were not appearing at the Metropolitan Opera.
That's right. The Chicago Opera in those days was not like what opera has become today, which is, I call, a traveling road show where Renee Fleming, for example, will appear in Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Munich, Berlin, Vienna, sometimes in the same productions. No, Chicago Opera had its own identity. The only two major singers that ever crossed over at the same time were Shaliapin, who sang two big seasons in Chicago, 1923 and 24, and Tony Del Monte, who sang 4 seasons in Chicago and concurrently sang a couple performances in New York. Gali Curci started in Chicago, made the big career, and she, for a couple years, was singing in New York and Chicago, and in the end, from 1923 to 29, only in New York. But other than that, the singers were all unique. The Metropolitan had Ponselle and Yaritzis. Chicago had Raisa and later Muzio.
So it tended to be that a major singer would choose one or the other, or would be chosen by one company or the other.
Things just happened. I mean, there's no doubt that early in her career, the Met was interested in Raisa. And there were complications. She felt very, very attached to Chicago, and Cleofonte Campanini, who discovered her, who was the director of the Chicago Opera. She had a loyalty to him, plus there was the complication of her husband, Rimini, who she insisted be part of any place where she went, and there was not really a suitable place at the Met for him, and it just never worked out.
We're speaking with Charles Mintzer, and we are talking about a great singer by the name of Rosa Raisa for whom Giacomo Puccini composed the role of Turandot, the title role of his final opera. She, in her heyday, in the late teens and through the 20s into the early 30s, was one of the greatest singers in the world, and her home base was Chicago. Mr. Mintzer, I should mention a interesting little connection that I have with Rosa Raisa, the closest I ever came to any kind of direct encounter with her. I was a member of the Lyric Opera Center of American Artists in the mid-'80s, in '85 and '86, their apprentice program, and so I sang one word in Madame Butterfly and one line in La Rondine and that kind of thing. In Madame Butterfly, for the Lyric Opera's production, I was the registrar who stood by as the wedding occurred between Cho-Cho-san and Pinkerton, and I had a sort of a desk that was hanging around my neck on a strap, kind of an old-fashioned portable desk, and on it was a beautiful old leather-bound ledger, and it was in there that the two were to sign their names at the sort of climax of the marriage ceremony. And the first time this book was placed in my hands in rehearsal as a prop, I opened it up, and what this book actually was a rehearsal book from the old Chicago Opera from around 1921. And so you would have written in ink, in cursive, rehearsals on Monday will be Thais and Mary Garden and so on, and these other venerable names from that era, and Lina Cavalieri and Rosa Raisa was one of the names that I saw on the pages of this precious book that was being used as a prop in this Madame Butterfly.
It burns in your hand.
Yes, exactly. And when I watch now the video of the PBS telecast, you don't get a very close look at this leather-bound book, but I remember thinking, even then, as someone who didn't know all that much about opera, but I was holding a bit of history in my hands of this amazing opera company in little old Chicago. Let's talk, though, about now Rosa Raisa and her interesting story. First of all, she is someone of mixed background, and you tell us in the book hers is a case where nationality and ethnicity as well as cultural factors converge to create definitional problems. That is, it is not easy for us to say that Rosa Raisa was of this or that nationality.
Exactly. Many books describe her because she was born in Białystok, which is technically Poland. You can't say she was a Polish soprano because she wasn't really of Polish nationality. I just did an article recently for Wikipedia on her, and I define her as a Polish-born, Italian-trained Russian Jew. That's who she was. So you work in, when you think of Polish singers, you think of Sembrek and Dereshki and people whose first language was Polish, and maybe if they were from a cultured background, that maybe they spoke French. And Raisa, in her home, they spoke Yiddish as their first language. She went to Russian language schools, and then, of course, when she emigrated at the age of 14 to Italy, she learned Italian and then English, and from all the touring in South America, Spanish and Portuguese. And, so she had a lot of easy language facility, but it's just hard to say what she was. She certainly wasn't a Polish soprano. If you say Russian, she's not really a Russian soprano. So you see, and the Jewish thing is such a big part of her background because she came from a very, very traditional background. In fact, I have a picture in the book of her mother and father, and her mother wears a wig, which Orthodox Jewish women wore. They covered up their own hair, and her father was in a black kaftan. That's the kind of background she came from.
You tell us that as a youngster, the year was 1906, she witnessed something truly horrific in her small community, and you say that Rosa Raisa was actually, in some ways at least, scarred for life.
Yes, she saw a horrible pogrom that broke out where For 3 days, she was, just for safety, she was holed up in a cellar. And when the pogrom was over, the killing and the massacre, she saw in the hospital courtyard the ripped up bodies of the people who had died, and she just realized then and there that there was no hope for her in Poland. She already was nursing some performing ambitions, which was unusual because in the community that she came from, a young girl was not as valued as a young boy for a profession on the stage. Well, the stage was taboo anyhow, but I'm not being clear. She came from a very conservative milieu, and these ambitions were perking up, were bubbling in her, but there was no hope in Poland. And as luck would have it, luck or fortune or happen chance, her cousin, this Dr. Vigdorchik, who was a dentist, had been arrested for being involved in some socialist activity, and he was exiled to Siberia. And when he was released, he emigrated to Italy. And where in Italy? Not to the big, noisy, dirty industrial cities of the north, but to sunny Capri. There was a lot of Russian emigres who had settled on Capri. And after the pogrom, Dr. Vigdorchik sent for his wife and children, and Raisa begged them to come along, that she would just help with her cousin, with the children. And that's where it all happened, on Capri.
This would be a way for her to escape to a place of greater promise. You tell us an amusing story about how, in fact, she was allowed to leave only if she took on the identity of the woman who was going to be their maid, and so
paperwork.
And so in order for her to be able to leave the country, she had to pretend that she was the woman who belonged with this particular passport and had to memorize this difficult name.
A real long Russian-Polish name. I forget it, Xenia something.
Vasilivna Stanislavskaya or something. I mean, a big mouthful. And here's this young woman needing to know this name and be able to say it just like that.
In the middle of the night, the customs inspectors or the border inspectors would come through, and you kind of they would take your papers and they would ask you to recite the information in the papers. And of course, you had to memorize that because that wasn't who you really were.
Well, she was successful in that venture and actually is able to escape to Italy, and she ultimately becomes a student at the Conservatory of Naples, which
was
we're
the
told,
top music school in Italy.
And so an incredible place where she received marvelous training. And of course, part of it was that as they heard the audition of this young woman, 14 years old, I think you tell us at the time,
right.
they could hear the gigantic potential of this amazing voice, even then.
Yes, it almost has a fairy tale-like quality, and it's very interesting. I often wonder if, now her older sister Sonia had already emigrated to the New World, to New York, and had worked in a dress factory. If Raisa had followed her sister Sonia, she may have come to New York and been one of those workers who had a voice, but nobody would have noticed. See, what happened on Capri when she was with her cousins, they had been befriended by a very wealthy family, the Oscarellis, and they brought Raisa along on a Sunday outing, and oh, you sing, let's hear your voice. And they were very impressed. And the Oscarellis were very well-connected people in Naples society, and they knew the singing teacher, Vincenzo Lombardi, who happened to have been Fernando de Lucia's teacher, and had some connection with the young Caruso, also from Naples. And they got her the audition at the Naples Conservatory, where she was picked up by Barbara Marchisio, who herself was a very, very famous singer in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. She and her sister Carlotta were friends of Rossini, and he wrote the Petite Messe Solennelle for them, and they were like a sister act. They did Norma and Semiramide were their two big operas, and they did them all over Europe. Very, very important people in the music world. And Carlotta Marchisio, Barbara's sister, was Norma, and Barbara was Adagisa. And they were doing Norma about 20 years after the opera was premiered. So there are a few little touches in Raisa's Norma recordings, not so much, but which come from that tradition, which comes closer to anything we have of singers who were close to Pasta and Grisi.
So, in other words, Raisa is so fortunate that she was, in a sense, in the right place at the right time.
Exactly.
To be heard by someone who could connect her with somebody important, who could give her the kind of training that could set all of this in motion.
Right.
And as you say, had this played out just a little bit differently, it's very possible that none of that would have happened in the same way.
She could have ended up working in a dress factory in New York, marrying young, pushing a baby carriage, having a voice, people telling her, "Oh, that's quite a voice," but never the chance to develop the potential.
She ends up, of course, making her way to America with someone named Cleofante Campanini.
Oh, yes.
And he's, of course, an important figure in Chicago opera, and it is he who is really Raisa's American champion. It's also Campanini who suggests that she change her name. Explain why that was thought to be important at this time.
Her name, when he first auditioned her, Marchisio had told him, this is all at the higher end of the Italian operatic establishment. Marchisio said, I'm training this young Russian girl with this phenomenal voice, but she's not quite ready. When I think she's ready, I want you to hear her. And so he had first dibs on her. And he said to her, "Well, what's your name?" He says, "My name is Raisa Buchstein." Buchstein. And he said, "Well, you can't make a career in America with that name." And so he said, "Raisa, well, what does that mean?" She said, "Well, it's like Rose in Italian." He said, "So we'll call you Rosa Raisa." And that's how her stage name and her persona was developed from 1913 on. In fact, when she made her debut in Parma under Campanini at the Verdi Centenary, in the program, she is listed as Raisa Burstein.
It's also interesting. At some point in the book, you show us the program for when she sings at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, and the great tenor John McCormick is in the cast, as is Claudio Muzio, but they get her name wrong. That is Raisa's name. She's listed as Rosina Raisa.
Yeah, that's just one of those things that happened. The typesetter or whoever got the thing couldn't figure it out, and maybe the name was scribbled, and he put Rosina. I have a later program where they corrected it to Rosa. I mean, that's just the way things happen in life. And then, of course, the reviews, because the reviewers pick up what they saw in the program, the reviews of that Mephistopheles performance are Rosina Raisa as Helen of Troy.
It's a career which unfolds very, very quickly. She has this amazing voice, which is in particular huge and rich, and she is able to make such a strong impression. But beyond her voice, you recount many reviews of her singing which tell us that there was also something about the open-heartedness or the generosity with which she sang.
Yes.
Tell us about that a little more.
Well, that's who she was. Her artistic, the driving artistic principle in her work was she wanted to thrill the public, and she had a wonderful cornucopia of gifts to do that. She had range; the voice could go very low and very high. and very securely high. And she had dynamics of power. She could sing very, very softly from a little filigree of tone to a wall-shattering fortissimo. And she also could move the voice around. So she had this coloratura skill. And also she was a very handsome woman. And by the way, she gives the lie to the idea that you have to be over-upholstered in order to have a large voice. She was, throughout most of her career, she was very, very slender for a singer. I mean, she did have a large chest development, but slender in the waist. And it's just an amazing gift. And also, often the reviewers would talk about her compelling acting, and she had this need to communicate, and the cry in the voice, and the what would you say? The communicative ability. She connected with audiences.
She is also, as much as we read in your book, apparently a very good person. I mean, we have a sense that there is real humanity in the way she dealt with colleagues and interacted with the public, and in the way in which she was so appreciative of all of the opportunities that had come to her.
Yes, and she sang a lot of concerts and performances for charity. She came up from that generation that believed that those who are blessed are also required to give back, and she gave back a lot, yes.
Tell us, or help us understand to what extent she was adored in the city of Chicago.
Oh, well, she had in her 21 seasons there, 1913-14, then 2 years she was in Europe, from 1916 to 32 every season. Then the company breaks up, then it reorganizes from the Chicago Civic Opera to the Chicago City Opera with less ambitious seasons. But she had 9 opening nights. That's almost Caruso-like in New York. Opening nights, new productions, the New Year's Eve gala performances. And on tour, remember the Chicago Opera, and this is something a lot of people don't understand. The Chicago Opera gave their 3-month season in Chicago, and that was, 7 performances a week. It was a huge undertaking. But then, after the Chicago season, they toured for 2 to 3 months. They would go to the East Coast, play New York and Boston, and then oftentimes they went all the way to California, through Texas, through the Midwest, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, Denver. Now, Raisa ended up singing, I believe, if I remember my totals, 275 times in Chicago and 235 times on the national tours. And on the national tours, she, Mary Garden, and Gali Curci, and then later, after Gali Curci, Claudia Muzio. Those were the 3 singers who were invariably in the performances. In other words, 2 to 3 times a week, each of those singers would sing. And in the promotion materials, you see the programs. They're the feature pictures, they're the drawing cards.
And of course, this helps us understand why the career didn't last longer than it did. I mean, she was a very, very busy singer, singing some of the most punishing roles in the repertoire. Turandot among them, although interestingly enough, she didn't sing the role of Puccini's Turandot.
Only 14 times.
Yeah.
8 times at the beginning at La Scala, twice in 1929 in South America, Buenos Aires, and 4 times in Chicago, 1934 and 35.
Your book contains fascinating photos from that, and some of her own account of what an amazing experience that was, and particularly that first performance of Turandot, where so famously Toscanini laid down his baton at the moment where Puccini had died, and,
Yes.
and the performance ends there. Tell our listeners an interesting story that is recounted in your book about why Rosa Raisa gave back her fee to La Scala for
It's very
Turandot.
interesting, and that involves the Chicago Opera. They had originally scheduled the Turandot for early April 1926, but the Chicago Opera tour, which involved Raisa and Rimini, her husband, didn't end that season until late March. It ended in Miami. Then she had to go to New York to get the boat. In those days, it took almost a week to cross the ocean, and she was late for the. She arrived there about 10 days, 2 weeks after the rehearsals had started, and Toscanini was furious, and she felt very guilty. She's, this wouldn't happen nowadays because with email and instant communication, logistics, that all would have been settled. But this is all done by letters and telegrams, and she may have said to Toscanini, to La Scala management, I'll come when the Chicago tour is over, but maybe because she was bound by the Chicago Opera, her contract included the tour. She was one of the big selling cards, so she had to do her Aidas and Trovatoris and Jewels of the Madonna and Giocondas on the tour. And so she was late, and Toscanini was quite angry, but then he mellowed. And but when it came for her fee, she just said, no, I was responsible for the delay of the first performance, and in conscience, I can't accept the fee. And she turned it back.
To help La Scala, which had to shell out money for all these extra unanticipated performances. It says something about Rosa Raisa. Another story about her, which I think also says something about the kind of woman she was she was someone who attended the Metropolitan Opera to hear fellow singers, good friends like Rosa Ponselle.
Oh, yeah.
And you tell us a story of 1936 when she attends the Met to hear her friend Florence Easton return to the Met in Valkyrie by Wagner.
Yeah, yeah.
And is in standing room.
Yes, believe it or not, the return of Florence Easton hadn't sung at the Met in about 4 years, and she was coming back for a single performance of Valkyrie. It was a Saturday night, which is usually a popular price performance with a somewhat lesser cast, but this was, Raisa was in New York, and she, Carol Longoni, her accompanist, and Rosa Ponselle wanted to hear their friend Florence Easton, and they ended up having to stand in standing room. There were just no tickets available. And I have since checked that out. I went into the Met Archives, and I looked at what the ticket sales were for that performance, and it was a sold-out performance. In other words, and every standing room ticket was taken.
So that would be a little bit today, like Renee Fleming going to the Lyric to hear her good friend Susan Graham, and it was a sellout. So Renee Fleming in standing room, if there was standing room at the Lyric Opera, which there isn't. But I mean,
yes, that's exactly the concept.
Wow.
Which to me indicated less about Raisa and Ponselle than it did about Florence Easton. Florence Easton must have been considered a singer, that is, someone who had a fabulous technique, was doing a role that on paper wasn't quite what you would have thought, but they wanted to hear this.
Well, the career of Rosa Raisa proceeds from strength to strength, many performances given with her husband, a baritone, and eventually in the mid-30s things slow down. By this point she is a mother and settles down into happy retirement, much of it spent in the city of Chicago.
Oh, yes.
One of the things you tell us is that unlike many Golden Age singers, Rosa Raisa seemed to have a capacity to appreciate the work of the new singers on the scene.
Exactly. It's very, very interesting. There's a book that all lovers of old singers have got their hands on. Franco Rasponi is the author, and he rounded up about 40, 50 of the old-time divas and sort of did interviews and got their memories, and there's basically a sour tone to many of them that, yes, well, the world has changed and the singers aren't as prepared as we were, and it's not as good. Raisa never felt that today's singers were any less than the singers in her day, that incredibly talented, and actually they had some advantages. They had tape recorders. She says, God, if we had a tape recorder in my age, we would have been able to listen to ourselves and hear the mistakes and make the improvements. She was amazed at what the technology was doing, and she believed that talent is talent, and people today are the young singers. There's some wonderful voices, and yes, she did lament that there weren't as many opportunities, and the training wasn't as intensive as when she started. But remember, she started studying singing when she was 14 years old, and she was already on the stage singing Aida and Mass Ball when she was 20. But this is also true of her contemporaries, Emmy Destin, Rosa Pansel, Claudia Muzio, Breathberg. They all started at a very early age, had their training already when they were teenagers, and that's just the way the world is organized. Nowadays, a dramatic soprano with the kind of voice Raisa had, or we believe she had, wouldn't even hit the stage until she was about late 20s or early 30s.
We should mention that the recordings made by Rosa Raisa, many of them are unsatisfying. That is, they do not
very
seem
mixed bag. Yes.
They do not seem to fully convey her greatness. But there are a handful of them which do seem to have captured the full splendor of this voice, or at least some hint of it.
a suggestion of the splendor. I don't think on any of them we get the splendor. I mean, the fabled power. But if you're accustomed to listening to old records, you can sort of, on individual notes and phrases, you can sort of hear what all the fuss was about.
I know that you lament the fact that nothing seems to survive from the many broadcasts which were made from the Chicago Opera. And you also tell a story which just makes us wring our hands in terrible frustration about live recordings that are believed to have been made of that historic debut premiere of Puccini's Turandot.
Oh, yes. I was told on very, very good authority that in 1926, remember, before 1926, recordings were made with not through electricity, but through a recording horn. Electrical recording with microphones came in 1926, late 1925, early 1926. And for this very important world premiere, they had set up microphones at La Scala, I don't think on the stage, but various places in the auditorium to capture it. And these were done on old 78 recordings. And when the matrices were shipped to the London factory of His Master's Voice, the head of the EMI cartel, HMV, or Voce del Padrone, the Italian wing, the box was marked defective. And the guy who actually destroyed the box told a man by the name of Vivian Liff the story that, yes, when the crates came, we threw them out. And so, remember, in those days, they knew something important was happening, but like now, every note of everything has been captured either on tape recorders, YouTube. We know so much. Almost everything that happens, we can get our fingers on right away. In 1926, there wasn't that sense of how important all this stuff was.
And now, of course, we would give
it was
anything.
Experimental at that time.
Right, and now we would give anything, of course, to have such a precious glimpse of Rosa Raisa live in performance.
Oh, in Turandot, oh, God, yes.
Well, we have at least some recordings, even one Vitafoam film, and of course this richly detailed biography, much of it drawn from her own autobiography, or the sketches for that. And it fills out richly for us this picture of one of the century's great singers and artists, her struggle to become a mother, her devotion to her fellow Jews, a moment of controversy when she performed before Adolf Hitler,
Oh, yes.
and other interesting stories which we will leave to our listeners to seek out in the pages of this book.
Thank
The
you.
book, again, called Rosa Raisa, A Biography of a Diva with Selections from Her Memoirs, published by Northeastern University Press. This still can be purchased easily through Amazon.com and other sources. And the author...
Online especially.
Very good. And Charles Mintzer, its author. Charles Mintzer, I have thoroughly enjoyed this and congratulate you on constructing such a fascinating book. It has been fun to talk with you about this and about your experience of researching this fascinating singer, Rosa Raisa. And I thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Greg.
We are approaching 9 o'clock here on WGTD. Monday on the morning show, Shelley Lewis joins us to talk about her fascinating and thought-provoking